when an unprecedented plague swept across the globe. How would humanity survive? While exploring a copper mine, a man was bitten by a venomous snake. Realizing it was the highly poisonous rattlesnake, he gritted his teeth against the pain and tried to call for help, but the numbness spreading through his body caused him to drop his phone. Isherwood quickly pulled out a knife and made a cut at the bite site, desperately sucking out the venom. There was no time to pick up his phone, so he staggered back home. Little did he know, this encounter would accidentally save his life. Bursting into the house in a panic, Isherwood downed a bottle of white liquor and collapsed onto the bed. He was relieved he made it back home in time to avoid further harm from wild animals. But the danger was far from over. Isherwood reminded himself not to forget to breathe. As his heartbeat quickened, he soon lost consciousness, but his body began to twitch uncontrollably. When he woke up the next day, he found his hand, where the snake had bitten him, swollen. Fortunately, he was still alive. As night fell, in his delirious state, Isherwood felt as though someone had visited him. However, after seeing his condition, the visitor did not offer help and quickly left. He only vaguely heard the person utter a strange phrase. The sun rose as usual, and Isherwood vaguely saw several helicopters flying overhead. He realized something serious was happening, but he couldn't move to investigate. At that moment, his mother, who hadn't contacted him in a long time, sent a farewell message. Unfortunately, Isherwood couldn't see it, as he was still fighting the venom. When his body finally reached its limits, he barely managed to crawl up and drink some water. Finding the bottle empty, Isherwood struggled to crawl off the bed and reach for another bottle. Starving, he even drank the spilled water from the floor. Luckily, Isherwood finally woke from his delirium. Without a phone, he had no idea how long he had been unconscious. He only knew that not only had he not died from the snakebite, but his hand had also healed completely. A sharp hunger suddenly hit him, and he decided to go to the town to find food, but he was shocked to find his car covered in dust. Isherwood was puzzled. How long had he been unconscious? But there was no time to think too much. After wiping off the car, he drove straight to the town. As soon as he reached the edge of the town, he sensed something was wrong. The streets, which should have been bustling, were now completely empty. He reached the supermarket, where he saw goods scattered on the ground as if someone had left in a hurry. When Isherwood saw the body on the floor, his heart sank. Judging by the state of the corpse and the surrounding flies, it was clear the person had been dead for quite some time. Although he didn't know exactly what had happened, the horrific scene around him clearly indicated something catastrophic had occurred here. At that moment, Isherwood noticed a warning sign, and he could no longer afford to think too much. He quickly drove towards his parents' house. From the radio broadcast, he learned that he had been unconscious for 3 weeks, during which a virus had erupted worldwide. It was highly contagious, with an extremely high fatality rate, and it spread rapidly across the globe. Authorities advised survivors to head to shelters. Stunned, Isherwood finally reached home, praying that his parents were safe. But when he entered the bedroom, the grim reality hit him. Seeing his father's lifeless body, Isherwood choked on his grief and cried out. Turning toward the bathroom, he found his mother had also collapsed beside the toilet. The sudden blow devastated him. Once his emotions settled, he buried his parents in their favorite garden. Having always preferred solitude, Isherwood now felt the oppressive weight of silence. He hoped to find other survivors like himself, so he began searching through the whole town. However, to his disappointment, everywhere he went, all he found were scattered remains. Unwilling to give up, he decided to head for the big city. He went to the supermarket to grab some supplies but didn't feel any excitement about the free goods. Isherwood followed the main road, but when he reached the bridge, he discovered that the way was blocked. Looking at the bodies on the ground, he screamed desperately. Unleashing his inner fear, he slapped himself hard, trying to convince himself it was all just a nightmare, but the sharp pain told him otherwise. The apocalypse had truly arrived. But Isherwood firmly believed that there were other survivors, so he headed to Las Vegas. To his utter despair, the once bustling, vibrant city of sin was eerily silent now, though backup power was still running and keeping the city operational. The beautiful sights appeared strangely sinister in the midst of the silence. Isherwood shouted angrily,
"Where the f*** is everyone?"
But the only response he received was complete silence. After a fruitless search, he resigned himself and lay in the luxurious hot spring, pondering where to go from here. Then, naked, he aimlessly wandered around. He went to the wine cabinet and poured himself a glass of the finest liquor. Just as Isherwood was about to take a sip,
Make mine a double.
a sudden sound startled him. two living people appeared before him. Isherwood quickly covered his body in embarrassment. From the news footage they had recorded, Isherwood finally learned why the apocalypse had come. It turned out that in the early stages of the virus outbreak, the authorities had immediately taken action. However, the vaccine they developed didn't work at all. Still, they claimed to have made a breakthrough and hid the truth, secretly burying the bodies of the infected who died. But they overlooked the virus's high transmissibility. By the time humanity realized the threat, it was already too late, leading to the extinction event. Fortunately, the woman and the old man had survived. Milton believed they must have some immunity to the virus. However, with nowhere else to go, Milton suggested they spend their remaining time drinking and enjoying themselves. But Isherwood disagreed with their outlook. He needed to think things through. Yet, looking at himself in the mirror, he didn't know what to do. So he fell into a deep sleep in the hallway. When he woke up, he began searching for Milton and Anne, fearful that they had only been a figment of his imagination. Luckily, he found Anne in the changing room, but he noticed and seemed to have lost the will to live. So he asked her about it.
Doesn't it matter you're still alive?
Just because my heart is beating doesn't mean I'm alive.
Milton had prepared breakfast for them, and they ate together happily. But when Isherwood told them he was planning to leave, and walked outside with a sorrowful expression, Milton tried to convince Isherwood to stay, explaining that he might be Anne's reason for living, as they had previously discussed ending their lives once the food ran out. Isherwood argued that the outside world was vast, and there were enough resources for them to survive for 10 years. But Milton said,
You've lost the only things you ever cared about? Why would living feel better than dying?
After saying that, Milton got up and left. Isherwood went to Anne, who was crying, and offered to take her with him. However, Anne smiled and shook her head, understanding that Anne had already made up her mind. Isherwood reluctantly left the building. Just then, he heard 2 gunshots. The world fell silent again. Isherwood completely broke down. He floored the accelerator, intending to end his life in that way, but a small dog's appearance made Isherwood change his mind. Seeing the dog, which had survived just like him, Isherwood regained his will to live. He immediately named the dog Lucky and took it into the car. With no more goals to pursue, Isherwood decided to return to where it all began. But before that, he took Lucky to the town's library to gather every survival book he could find, then returned to the place that felt like home. The man and the dog began their new life together. However, even the loneliest days eventually become tiresome. A year passed in monotony, repetitive chores, joyless drives around the property. Just when he felt he couldn't go on, Lucky, who had been quiet for so long, suddenly started barking wildly. Isherwood turned to the direction Lucky was barking at and saw a plume of smoke rising in the distance. Eagerly, he drove to the house, but before he could enter, a woman with a gun on the roof stopped him. Seeing another survivor, Isherwood was overwhelmed with excitement. He quickly explained that he hadn't seen anyone alive in so long.
What do you want?
Isherwood explained that they were neighbors, and when he saw the smoke, he rushed over to check if there were any survivors. Emma invited Isherwood inside and warmly made him a cup of tea. Isherwood introduced himself briefly. He was a geologist, 27 years old, and in good health. Emma seemed intrigued by this. Seeing Emma's charming smile, Isherwood awkwardly began to prepare to leave, but Emma insisted he stay. Since Emma had extended such a warm invitation, Isherwood had no reason to refuse. They ended up talking all night. Emma explained that she had been here for a few days. She chose to stay in this house, which was marked for sale, because she believed there were no bodies here. Upon hearing this, Isherwood immediately extended an invitation to Emma, suggesting she move in with him since his house was large enough. Emma, who'd expected to die alone, accepted without hesitation. They returned to Isherwood's home, and Emma was very pleased with the place. She happily began to explore the backyard. Seeing the sudden appearance of another human, Isherwood regained his hope of surviving. He anxiously went back inside and cut the rope he had prepared for hanging. When they discovered that the food at home had been eaten by rats, they went to the supermarket for a round of free shopping. However, the bodies on the ground constantly reminded them that this was the end of the world. Finally, they had a companion, and they couldn't help but chat, not noticing the inconspicuous rats. After loading up the supplies they had chosen, Isherwood went home and made Emma a nutritious lunch. During the meal, they talked about the disaster. Isherwood thought they had survived due to some random genetic mutation or natural immunity. Emma said it might be Mother Earth getting revenge on humanity, seeing them as a virus, but this also reminded them that in order to survive, they must keep fighting. So, they began to use their respective skills. Isherwood handled construction, while Emma went out to gather food. In their free time, Isherwood would fish by the river to provide extra protein for the table, and they lived a happy life. At first, they were polite to each other, but as time passed, they could no longer suppress the sparks in their hearts. Under the witness of heaven and earth, they naturally became husband and wife. However, to live a happy life, they needed ample food and energy. To solve this, Isherwood installed solar panels on the roof, but as he tried to climb the support frame, he accidentally slipped and fell. Fortunately, not breaking any bones, just spraining his ankle. Emma's mother had been a nurse, so using the knowledge she learned from her, Emma applied some ointment to Isherwood's injury. 6 months passed in the blink of an eye. Emma excitedly told her husband that she was pregnant, but Isherwood showed a worried look.
No hospitals. No doctors. No safety net.
Emma understood her husband's worries and immediately comforted him. Isherwood asked how they would protect the child. If anything happened to them, what would happen to the baby?
I need you to believe in us, in this, in a future.
Emma's words reignited Isherwood's fighting spirit. So, he took Lucky and went to the library to collect books on pregnancy and postpartum care. Desperately cramming this knowledge, he didn't notice Lucky barking at mice. Later, Isherwood brought back a pile of supplies, always preparing for the baby's arrival. From that day on, Isherwood tried every way possible to provide nutritious meals for his wife. But looking at the plate of vegetables, Emma said she wanted meat, a big piece of it. Reluctantly, Isherwood took his hunting rifle and went to a nearby farm. There, he found several cows. Isherwood saw a calf grazing alone. He didn't want to kill it, but for the health of his wife and child, he had to pull the trigger. However, one shot didn't kill the calf. So Isherwood had to fire again. Despite having no experience in butchering, he followed the instructions in the books and finally obtained the meat Emma had been craving. Everything was moving in the right direction. The solar panels were completed, and they successfully gained electricity, allowing them to store excess food in the fridge. But Emma then delivered some bad news. She had found a rat in the bathroom and had to put in a lot of effort to drown it. This was unusual. She had never encountered rats that liked to live in the bathroom. Suddenly, countless rats appeared on the streets of the town, as if they had been summoned, all heading toward Isherwood's house. Emma and Isherwood immediately realized that the rats were attracted by the smell of food. As Emma killed the rats, Isherwood burned the garbage and discarded food. They thought this would drive the rats away, but more and more rats gathered. Isherwood finally remembered the beef. He quickly ran back inside, carried it out, and threw it into the fire. But this had the opposite effect, attracting even more rats. Facing the swarm of rats, Emma and Isherwood had no choice but to retreat into the house, sealing the gaps with whatever tools they had. But the rats, now tasting the food, didn't seem ready to leave them alone. Fortunately, the house was sealed tightly, and they managed to escape the immediate danger. However, Lucky's cries suddenly rang out. It had been trapped outside by the rats. To save his companion, Isherwood had no choice but to open the door and bring Lucky back, which allowed many rats to sneak into the house. Helpless, he grabbed a baseball bat and began clearing them one by one. With Emma's help, Lucky's injuries were treated. They spent a sleepless night. Isherwood worried that something might go wrong during Emma's delivery, but she reassured him that she had experience. Before the apocalypse, she had given birth to 2 daughters with her previous husband. The sun rose as usual, and the rat problem was solved by the arrival of a group of cats. Just as Isherwood breathed a sigh of relief, Emma told him some good news. The baby was about to arrive. With Isherwood's help, Emma began the long labor, though they encountered some difficulties. The first baby born after the apocalypse was finally delivered safely. They named their daughter Heather, and from then on, they lived a happy life. They thought their peaceful days would continue like this, but then a figure appeared in the town and saw the notice Emma had written. Isherwood was rushing home with the food he had just gathered when he suddenly hit a lion on the way. Looking at the dying lion, Isherwood was about to show mercy, but the sound from the woods caught his attention. He saw the figure of a little girl fleeing quickly. Panicked, Isherwood chased after her and soon stopped her. Trying to explain his actions, he said he meant no harm, and that he had taken out the weapon only to put the lion out of its misery. When he saw that the little girl had not run away again, Isherwood continued to explain that he was a father and already had 2 children. They lived in the town not far away with another couple. Aware of the dangers of the wild, Isherwood kindly suggested that he could take her in. provided that she had no home. The girl seemed to waver. However, just as Isherwood tried to check her wounds, the girl suddenly screamed, causing him to quickly step back. Understanding the girl's fear, Isherwood changed his approach. He told the girl that he would go back to the truck and wait, and if she wanted to eat or find a place to stay, it would all be up to her. After saying this, Isherwood returned to the truck, but he was surprised to find that the lion that had been hit had disappeared. However, he didn't care. Little did he know, this would bring about his doom. After some anxious waiting, the little girl finally appeared. Cautiously, Isherwood tossed her an apple. Seeing the girl devour it hungrily, it was clear that she had been starving for a long time. It seemed that she realized that the man in front of her was a good person, so the little girl carefully got into the truck, but she remained vigilant. Isherwood was delighted, and then took the little girl back to his home. When Emma learned of the new guest, she warmly welcomed her along with the children, but the little girl was just full of sadness and didn't say a word. No matter how much Isherwood expressed his kindness, she remained tense and vigilant. Realizing the girl needed time, Emma and Isherwood didn't press her, only telling her that she could stay for as long as she wanted. Isherwood shared the situation with Jorge, who thought the girl might have autism, but Isherwood believed it was post-traumatic stress disorder. The girl must have gone through something terrifying during the apocalypse, which was why he didn't want to leave her in the woods. Emma suggested that her husband should check the place where he found the girl, to ensure she was truly alone. When Maureen heard that Isherwood had brought back a little girl, an odd feeling rose within her. The next morning, Maureen brought breakfast to the girl, only for the girl to spill the food due to her strong sense of distrust. However, when the girl saw the scars on Maureen's arm, which were similar to her own, the girl recoiled in fear. Maureen, seeing this, gently said that when she was a little girl, she too had suffered abuse, and that she understood the girl's fear. Then Maureen tried to have the girl touch her hair, which seemed to remind her of her mother, and eventually, the girl started to trust her. Maureen then led the girl back inside and prepared a bath for her, assuring her that it was safe and that no one would harm her here. Maureen explained that she had also considered giving up, but when she saw the sign left by Emma, she reignited her will to survive, and that's why she and her husband had decided to stay. After saying this, Maureen chose to leave, leaving the little girl some privacy. At the same time, Isherwood and Jorge arrived at the woods where the girl had been found. There, they discovered a small cabin, filled with various horrifying torture devices, and the scene left both men horrified. Maureen quietly opened the girl's backpack and, upon flipping through a drawing book, she learned about the terrible things the girl had endured. She also found a note in the backpack. After arranging the little girl in a comfortable room, Maureen immediately called everyone together and read out the note. The note was written by the girl's mother, and it said that the girl's name was Eevee, that she was a child of misfortune, and that if anyone found the note, she prayed to God that her daughter was still alive. It turned out that after the apocalypse, their family was lucky to survive, but the father blamed everything on the daughter and vented all his anger on Eevee, causing her to stop speaking. Eevee's mother tried to protect her, but failed. She realized that her time was running out and she could no longer protect Eevee. So, she left the note, hoping that if anyone found her daughter still alive, they would treat her kindly. This was a mother's final act of protection. Every word on the note touched everyone's heart and reminded Maureen of her own painful past. They decided to take care of Eevee in place of this great mother. Days passed, and Isherwood and Emma welcomed their third child. Their lives continued as usual, filled with happiness, and they spent a joyful year together. One day, the sound of a bell suddenly woke Isherwood. Realizing something had entered their territory, Emma and the others grabbed their weapons and went to the backyard. After searching separately, they found the three intruders. Once both sides confirmed there was no threat, they lowered their weapons at the same time. It turned out that it was their children who had accidentally triggered the alarm, and they had been so alert because they were afraid someone might harm the children. After the misunderstanding was cleared, Isherwood invited them into the house, and the children quickly began playing together. The woman explained that they had been traveling along the road, but became curious and decided to investigate after seeing the sign left by Emma. The woman's name was Molly, a surgeon. After surviving the apocalypse, she had been traveling alone in search of other survivors. Eventually, she met Ezra and Jean in Ashland, and they formed a large family together. At this point, Maureen felt that Jean looked familiar. Ezra proudly introduced his wife, saying she had been a big star before the apocalypse. After learning their situation, Emma decided to temporarily take them in and let them stay in the house next door. However, Isherwood was very concerned about the fact that they carried weapons, fearing they could pose a threat to their family. When Emma heard her husband's words, she gently comforted him, explaining that in the post-apocalyptic world, everyone was cautious, but there was no need to overthink it. They could observe the newcomers for a while before making any decisions. The next morning, Isherwood decided to organize a supply search activity to observe the newcomers' behavior. The children stayed at home, under the care of Emma and Maureen. After explaining what they needed to collect, Isherwood led everyone to the town. Before they even got out of the truck, he noticed a bison blocking the road. Fortunately, it wasn't a dangerous animal, and as long as they didn't disturb it, there was no risk. They split into pairs and began their search. Isherwood reminded them not to separate. However, Molly chose to go off alone and headed to the hospital to look for any leftover medications. When she arrived at the hospital, she didn't realize the danger as she gazed at the skeletal remains on the beds. Just as she was about to continue her search, a wild dog suddenly appeared and blocked her way. The dog's menacing stare made Molly step back in fear. Fortunately, there was a fire extinguisher nearby. Molly used it to scare the wild dog away. Her efforts paid off when she finally discovered a locked medical room. After smashing the door open, she found a large supply of medicines inside. When the group regrouped, Isherwood realized that Molly hadn't returned. Just as he was getting worried, Molly appeared, carrying a large amount of supplies. Seeing that everything was useful, Isherwood didn't chastise her further. The group returned home safely before nightfall. To celebrate the successful supply run and to welcome the new members, they threw a party. Jean played the guitar and sang a sweet song for everyone. Seeing the smiles on everyone's faces, Isherwood realized that his excessive caution since the apocalypse had made him overly wary. It seemed that letting Molly and her group join their family wasn't such a bad thing after all. The party ended perfectly in laughter and joy. However, late at night, Jean secretly drank alone, trying to rid herself of the unborn child. Clearly, the apocalyptic environment had twisted Jean's mental state. When Molly discovered this, she comforted Jean with great care, assuring her that no matter what hardships they faced, she would fully support her. Thankfully, with Molly's gentle encouragement, Jean finally accepted the reality of her pregnancy. Time passed quickly, and Jean's belly grew bigger. With the care of everyone, she successfully gave birth to the child. Meanwhile, Jorge and Maureen also welcomed their first baby, and everything seemed to be moving in a good direction. 7 years flew by. Lucky had grown old, but Heather celebrated her 14th birthday. Everyone gathered to celebrate her, creating an incredibly warm scene. Over the years, Eevee, who had once been so silent, finally began to show a smile. Since there was no school, Isherwood personally educated his younger son. He often took Joey to the library to read and learn. One day, as a heavy thunderstorm raged outside, Isherwood felt an ominous premonition and immediately drove back home with his son. Once he confirmed that everyone was safe, he realized that Lucky was missing. Isherwood anxiously went out to search, eventually finding Lucky, who had already passed away, beneath a fallen tree. As he moved the log away, Isherwood broke down in tears, holding his companion of 14 years. He couldn't find the words to express his grief. The group made a beautiful grave for Lucky, but Isherwood could never shake the sadness. As he was watching the kids, he was shocked to see that a lion had already set its sights on Joey. Isherwood yelled for the kids to run. The lion, enraged, lunged at him and pinned him to the ground. He tried to grab a hammer nearby, but the lion gave him no chance, viciously tearing into him. Seeing Isherwood in danger, Eevee screamed for help. By the time the group managed to rescue Isherwood, he was barely alive. Under Molly's guidance, Emma and the others worked hard to save Isherwood. However, the rudimentary medical conditions of the apocalypse were not enough to stabilize Isherwood's vital signs, and he quickly lost his breath. In desperation, Molly performed CPR. Fortunately, after relentless efforts, he began to breathe again, with Emma continuously calling his name. Isherwood's condition eventually stabilized. After stitching his wounds, all they could do was pray and wait. But seeing her unconscious husband, Emma was filled with anger. She grabbed a weapon and headed straight to the place of the attack. Following the trail of blood, she tracked her way into the woods. Seeing the lion still growling, Emma decisively pulled the trigger, then fired several more shots, venting her anger. Thankfully, under Molly's careful care, Isherwood eventually woke up. After 2 months of recovery, he was finally able to walk. The children eagerly gathered around to celebrate this beautiful moment. Emma finally let go of her worries. 3 years quickly passed. Even Joey, the youngest, had learned how to fish. Heather and Rafe had grown into young adults, and they spent every day exploring the surrounding area, filling them with a longing for the outside world. After some discussion, Heather and Rafe decided to leave and see the world. Although Isherwood was deeply worried and disagreed with the kids leaving, he knew that as they grew up, he would have to learn to let go. Heather and Rafe, who had never left the town, set out on their unknown journey with the blessings of their family. They promised to return when winter arrived. What the group didn't expect was that they would be gone for 6 years. During that time, their home faced crises they had never encountered before. One day, Eevee prepared ingredients to cook a hearty dinner for everyone. Just as she turned on the tap to fill the water, she discovered that the once abundant tap water had disappeared. Realizing the gravity of the situation, Isherwood and the others went to the reservoir, only to be shocked to find the water source had dried up, and the pipes had corroded from rust, leaving large holes. As they were figuring out what to do, Joey heard a rumbling sound from afar. A convoy of vehicles appeared on the dam, having not seen strangers in years. Isherwood immediately prepared to return home with his son, unsure of the safety of the newcomers. He wasn't about to risk everyone's lives. When he called his family on the intercom but received no response, Isherwood anxiously drove back home. His first act was to urge the children inside, but before they could act, the convoy arrived at their doorstep. With that, Isherwood and the others cautiously made their way to the front door. The man in charge introduced himself as Charlie, explaining that they knew about the water shortage and just wanted to offer their help as a symbol of peace. He also introduced his wife, Perry. Seeing Charlie extend an olive branch, Isherwood couldn't refuse outright. He took a sip of water to show his sincerity. However, Isherwood was still cautious and wouldn't open the door until he understood their true intentions. Charlie, however, gave him a reason he could not ignore. The drought had already set in, and Charlie's team just happened to have a drilling rig with the skills to operate it expertly. A short-term shortage of food could be tolerated, but a lack of water was simply unacceptable. In order to ensure the survival of his group in the post-apocalyptic world, Isherwood reluctantly agreed to host Charlie and his group on the condition that they provide the necessary supplies in exchange for drilling the well, after which they would part ways. It was this decision, where each side took what they needed, that ultimately brought disaster to Isherwood's team. After accepting their hospitality, Charlie and his team began drilling the well, estimating it would take 72 hours. During this time, Isherwood took Charlie into the woods to hunt, hoping to learn more about him, but just as they spotted a deer, a sudden gunshot startled Isherwood, but Charlie didn't seem to mind. The newcomers quickly blended in with the group, and Charlie made a point of showing kindness, but the way he looked at Eevee seemed to carry an unsettling glint. Isherwood noticed it all. He told his wife he didn't trust Charlie. Emma, on the other hand, argued that Isherwood was always suspicious of newcomers, just like when Ezra and the others showed up, but they ended up staying, and Molly even saved Isherwood's life. Isherwood acknowledged that he had been wrong last time, but he had a feeling that when the well was finished, Charlie and his group wouldn't leave. He also expressed concern over the way Charlie looked at Eevee and feared for her safety, but Emma dismissed it as normal, seeing that his wife did not support him. Isherwood chose to keep a close watch on Charlie's every move from a higher vantage point. As he pondered how to handle the potential danger, the well was finally completed. With water spraying into the air, everyone was immersed in joy, as Isherwood predicted, when he suggested that they provide supplies and let Charlie's group leave. Charlie instead expressed a preference for staying in this place. A crisis was quietly approaching. To celebrate the success of securing water, a party was held. After the festivities, Isherwood stood on the rooftop, filled with unease. Suddenly, he heard a scream. He quickly went to investigate and saw Charlie smugly walking out of Eevee's room. Isherwood hurried into Eevee's room and brought her, shaken and terrified, to the main hall. After Molly's inspection, it was confirmed that Charlie had insulted Eevee, an act that was absolutely intolerable to them. Isherwood declared that Charlie was nothing more than a predator, traveling from place to place in search of new prey, and their family had now become his target. Emma admitted she had been wrong, but now, they had to deal with Charlie. After some discussion, the group decided that the only way to ensure their safety was to kill Charlie. Even if they drove him out, he would return eventually, and this was the safest and most reliable solution. So, Isherwood went to find Charlie alone. Realizing Isherwood's intent, Charlie dropped his act. He pulled out a knife and declared that in the apocalypse, the weak died first, and he was the wolf who preyed on the naive. Charlie thought his arrogant attitude would intimidate Isherwood, but what he didn't expect was that Isherwood wasn't alone. He had a whole family behind him. Seeing Charlie's disgusting face, remembering what Eevee had endured, Isherwood finally snapped and made his move. Isherwood still wanted to vent his anger, but Ezra stepped forward and stopped him. After killing someone for the first time, Isherwood went to the bathroom and scrubbed the bloodstains from his clothes. The experience seemed to have left a deep shadow in his heart. The next morning, Molly and the others broke the news of Charlie's death to Perry. They expected her to retaliate, but instead, Perry seemed relieved. It turned out that she, too, had been a victim. With that, things became easier. When Silas and Corey arrived, looking for Charlie, Emma told them that Charlie was no longer here. Silas seemed to realize something, but seeing the heavily armed group around him, he didn't dare make a move. Isherwood gave everyone a choice: follow Silas and leave or stay. The decision was theirs. To his surprise, everyone chose to stay, with only Silas deciding to leave. However, it wasn't long before Silas returned, begging Isherwood to take him in, saying he had nowhere else to go. However, remembering that Silas had been guarding the door while Charlie committed his crime, Isherwood couldn't forgive him. In the end, he coldly turned Silas away. 6 years flew by in an instant. 20 years had passed since the apocalypse began, and with the addition of newcomers, Isherwood's community had grown larger. Under his guidance, his young son Joey displayed incredible creativity. In a time of fuel shortages, he had managed to build a solar-powered plane capable of flying for 100 kilometers. Joey's goal in building the plane was to search for Heather and Rafe, who had not returned. But before he could fulfill his wish, another disaster struck. One night, Joey, drenched in sweat, stumbled into Isherwood's room and collapsed to the floor, falling unconscious. Several others in the community had also fallen ill. At first, they thought it was just the flu, but Molly informed Isherwood that this was clearly the virus that caused the apocalypse. The virus was highly contagious, and Molly advised everyone to wear masks and isolate the infected. But fearing the loss of his son, Isherwood insisted on keeping Joey by his side. The illness quickly spread, and half of the community was bedridden, but Molly had no solution. Watching his son grow weaker, Isherwood prayed for a miracle. Just when hope seemed lost, a good news arrived. Heather, who had been gone for 6 years, had returned. However, she was alone. Rafe had left her. Now, all she wanted was to stay and be with her brother until he recovered. But would the miracle really come? Or was there an even greater disaster waiting for them all? Upon hearing that Heather had returned, Jean asked her how her son had left. Heather then recounted the 6 years she and Rafe had spent on the road. After leaving home, they had driven north, witnessing landscapes they had never seen before, but never encountering a single living person. Though they had agreed to return home by winter, Heather and Rafe decided to keep going, hoping to find more survivors. They explored town after town, only to find them all deserted. Just when they were about to give up, they saw numbers and arrows marked on a wall. Though they didn't know what it meant, they understood that it was a direction they could not ignore, so they followed the signs. But the journey took them far beyond their original plans, and they decided to settle in one place. 6 years passed, and after finding nothing, they finally decided to return home. Before they left, however, they decided to explore an unknown area, a decision that would bring them disaster. Heather was thrilled to discover a Pacific yew tree, known for its medicinal properties, capable of curing many diseases. She planned to return to camp and get tools to bring it back. On the way back, she suddenly encountered a ragged man. Before she could ask him anything, he ran off. Realizing not to trust strangers, Rafe decided they would take turns keeping watch that night. However, just as Heather was organizing the tent, she suddenly heard Rafe scream from behind her. She turned around to see him being held hostage by the same man from before. The man demanded food from her. Seeing this, Heather quickly promised to hand over everything, begging the man not to harm Rafe. But at that moment, Rafe suddenly fought back. In the chaos, the man stabbed him with a knife. Seeing Rafe collapse in pain, the man frantically apologized, saying it was not intentional, but Heather was already consumed by rage. She immediately threw the axe in her hand. Though she killed the man, Rafe bled out and lost his life. After burying Rafe in grief, Heather began her journey home, finally arriving safely months later. Upon learning the details of her son's death, Jean tearfully embraced Heather. Ezra, standing nearby, was also consumed by grief. But there were more urgent matters to address back at home. The apocalyptic virus had resurfaced, and not only was Joey in danger, but many others had been quarantined at the hospital. To save his son, Isherwood ventured into the city, a place he had always avoided. There, in a hospital, he managed to find some supplies. He rushed home in a panic, trying to transfuse blood into Joey to provide antibodies, but Heather stopped him. Heather explained that Molly was using the yew tree she had brought back to make medicine. As they argued, Joey's fever worsened, and in a panic, Isherwood rushed him to the hospital, but the medicine still needed time to be made, and Joey might not survive that long. In a moment of desperation, Molly suggested immediately lowering Joey's temperature. Isherwood, listening to her, turned to Jorge for help. They took Joey into the forest and placed him in a pool of water. All they could do now was pray. With the new medicine, others began to improve, and Molly allowed herself a slight sigh of relief. At that moment, Corey approached Heather, asking what the man she had encountered looked like. Heather explained that the man's beard was so thick that she couldn't see his face clearly, but the one thing she remembered was a golden tattoo on his arm. That instantly made Corey realize that the man was Silas, the one whom Isherwood had kicked out. Joey was brought back home, but his condition worsened instead of improving. As Isherwood and Emma watched in sorrow, Joey slowly stopped breathing. Their beloved son was gone forever. The community held a funeral for the lost, and Isherwood, disregarding Jorge's attempts to stop him, hysterically ran to the small town. He desperately began to erase the slogans Emma had left behind, venting his grief in his own way. Just as Isherwood was about to burn the books, Emma appeared and stopped him, saying that although Joey was gone, there were still other children who needed to learn. They were the hope for the future. Realizing his wife was right, Isherwood reluctantly abandoned his plan to burn the books, but the loss of his son weighed heavily on him, and he couldn't find peace. Life, however, had to continue. Isherwood went alone to the mountaintop. As he gazed at the breathtaking sunset, it seemed like he had come to a realization. The earth would not stop turning because one person had left. Everything was slowly beginning to recover. The beautiful future still had to be written by humanity itself. Back at home, Isherwood continued to teach the children, but this time, he didn't write a single word on the blackboard. Instead, he began telling them stories of the world that once was. It was a world vastly different from the one they lived in now. Human greed sparked endless wars. In the city, the stars were nearly invisible, replaced only by a gray, overcast sky. Everyone was struggling just to survive, their innocent smiles long gone. Isherwood explained that he had always tried to pass on the knowledge of the past, attempting to rebuild the world that once was. But was that really the world they wanted now? The sky was blue now, the trees lush and green, and they had pure, natural food to eat. If Earth could reboot, then humanity could too. From that day on, he would no longer act as a teacher. Instead, he would let the children learn from nature itself. The new world would teach them what they needed to know, showing them how humanity and the Earth could live in harmony. This, he believed, was the true meaning of the apocalypse. A year later, Isherwood finally gathered the courage to enter Joey's room. He had planned to sort through his son's belongings, but what he found on one of Joey's notebooks shocked him. Joey had been researching radio technology and had even drawn blueprints. They only needed to follow the instructions to build a radio capable of sending and receiving messages. Joey had hoped to use it to find more survivors. This discovery made Isherwood realize how farsighted his son had been. Despite his young age, he pinned all the blueprints to the wall and called everyone together. He was determined to make the hope Joey had left behind a reality. The radio station was completed, and Isherwood began trying every frequency. He wrote down the channels with no response and continued trying others. Isherwood's voice broadcasted through the radio to the world, but still, no one answered. Knowing the pressure was getting to him, Emma urged Isherwood to relax. She took him to an open field, where they played baseball with their family. The joyful atmosphere spread, and everyone's faces were filled with happiness. It was during this gathering that Isherwood had an unexpected breakthrough. Heather didn't understand why baseball had so many technical terms related to numbers. Isherwood explained that people of the past were obsessed with statistics, and numbers were how humanity understood the world.
147225.
Heather said that this string of numbers was something she and Rafe discovered during their travels. It appeared on almost every rooftop. At the time, they didn't understand its significance, but now it seemed to correspond to a radio frequency. Excited, Isherwood rushed back home and quickly activated the radio, eagerly calling the frequency. The others gathered as he called out repeatedly, and after several attempts, a response finally came through. The sudden voice thrilled everyone. Through their conversation, they learned that the speaker was in a park 100 kilometers away, and there were 75 survivors there. The speaker asked if Isherwood's group would come to them, or if they should bring their people to meet Isherwood's group. This made Ezra uneasy. He warned everyone to think carefully before responding, as they couldn't trust strangers easily. Understanding what Ezra meant, everyone fell silent. Then the voice spoke again, saying they were also afraid and would understand if Isherwood's group felt the same. When they first set up the frequency, many had opposed it.
Why did you?
Something kept telling us. We had to.
We have to.
This woke everyone up. If humanity was to survive, they needed to unite and help each other. Everyone agreed to seek out the others, and Isherwood responded as well.
Yes.
50 years had passed since the apocalypse. By now, Isherwood was old and gray. He passed his hammer on to the next person, ensuring that humanity's civilization would continue. Earth abides ended here. Humanity had brought pollution to the earth. To keep the environment clean, the effort needed to come from people all around the world. Let's continue to spread the spirit of environmental protection and work together to create a beautiful home.